Hello there. Welcome to this week's episode of the Data Radio Show. This week I'm sitting down with Max Theseira. He's worked across a number of fields in education and corporate change, particularly around technology and transformation spaces. It's teaching people how to use new tech, showing people how new tech is going to change what they do, particularly with corporate clients. He is a very, very popular consultant in this field, working out of Australia. So let's sit down, catch up with Max, learn a little bit about him, and also how he, as somebody who educates people on this, sees the world changing thanks to AI and Gen AI. Joining me today, I have Max Theseira. You are a lifelong expert in this sort of digital transformation space, which I guess is code for you've done a lot of stuff. Is that a fair summary?
Yes. I for longer than I want to confess, I guess I've been in the advisory space, working for companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, IBM's business consulting. I started up my own consultancy for a period of time for about eight to 10 years, and co-founded another consultancy. Really, I guess I've worked at the intersection of people, technology, and change. And so those three things coming together, if I had to describe where I spend most of my time, it's actually helping large organizations drive adoption of new ways of working that are enabled by technology.
I imagine then that sort of the goalposts shift on that a lot over time. Yeah, the technology we had 30 years ago is completely different to how we use and interact with technology today.
Absolutely. I mean, it's moved, and it's the pace of change is becoming even quicker
Hmm.
now. I think. I'm also an educator at the business school in Melbourne Business School, and University of New South Wales, the Australian Graduate School of Management. And focusing on executive education, and demand for education has gone up, particularly because of what you've just mentioned. That sort of the change over the years, over the decades, but more so in recent times. With the whole buzz around generative AI and how that's sort of captured the world. Um, and I've been lucky that I've managed to take a bit of time out of corporate world, out of the workforce, to spend and indulge myself in generative AI in the last few months. Combination of formal training and hands-on experience, and just getting myself in the generative AI space, which is kind of still emerging, right?
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, absolutely. And if you think about where this could end up, talking about the pace of change and where it could go, there's those two very polarizing views. One, which is that apocalyptic view of, generative AI is going to take over the world and robots are going to rule
Hmm.
us. But the very other side, utopian world of, we've dealt with things like disease and inequality financially across the globe, and solved. We've got an abundance of ability to live in this in the world, and we don't have to work any longer. Very polarizing views, and of course, it's probably somewhere in between. But as I start to understand this technology even more and more, and where we've got to today, I think we are at that really interesting point where, regardless of which way it can go, we're in an interesting place, interesting time to live in, with where technology is going. And really, for me, I think I'm probably more on the half full rather than half empty. I think we're probably on the optimistic side rather than the pessimistic side of where things might end up. Yeah.
The Star Trek future, not the Terminator future.
Yes, exactly.
With your roles teaching, you obviously must come into contact with a lot of younger people, sort of newer generations that would be a bit more of a digital native than some of those older generations that are wanting to sort of retrain in the world of generative AI. Are you finding different sort of outlooks, different attitudes or skill sets that are coming through in younger generations that people aren't necessarily aware of if they're looking at it as a retraining option?
There's always this idea that the younger generation are highly savvy with technology, and therefore have a very different outlook. I think maybe to a certain extent that might be true, but actually, you know, COVID has changed things, and even the older generation have had to get to grips with technology in a way that they've never had to in the past. And so I think of I use a litmus test of my mum and dad. They're sort of churchy people, and you couldn't go to church, so they got their masses through streaming online, and then they started to get into that whole thing, right? And so very these are people who are 80 years old. And so having to kind of order your groceries online. And so things have changed. So yes, there is a difference, the younger people. My focus on education has been at the executive level, and what I do notice is that there's even more demand from an older generation to understand. With a change management lens on, when you think of what it's going to take in large corporates to change, education is a really important thing. And quite often in the past, education, change management interventions have included things like training, but that's been very much at the operational level. Whereas what I see with generative AI is actually a demand and a need, even if there isn't a demand, there's a need, from board level to executive level to middle management to the rest of the employees. And so actually everybody's hungry to understand this better. Either they're hungry for it or they don't know that they need it, but they do need it in order to be able to succeed. And so from a change management standpoint, actually thinking about AI literacy across the organization and what it's going to take to support organizations, exploit these new technology as it comes through. AI literacy is a really important component, and it goes across the board.
Do you
Yeah.
find with those people coming in for change management plans and sort of working out how they're going to do that, any kind of misconceptions that people bring to the table? Is there a common misconception around what AI offers or the way it's going to change things?
Common misconception. I guess the thing that comes to mind in particular would be that they're captured by generative AI. And so there's this idea that generative AI can be used across the whole of your value chain. And that is right, but actually it may not be the best tool for the job. And so the misconception really is around understanding traditional AI and generative AI and understanding that there are horses for courses. And so people are in this consumed by generative AI and what it could offer, and quite rightly so, because it's quite different. But at the same time, I think you're going to miss a trick if you're just focusing on generative AI. Actually, there's a whole load of technologies out there, and traditional AI and machine learning is actually equally important. Yeah.
How do you think AI is going to change your job?
My job. Well,
Yeah.
I think that AI is actually going to change everyone's role. It's already starting to change everyone's role. And quite often there's actually that's interesting because as humans we tend to, I guess, overestimate the impact on the short-term impact of new technology and underestimate the longer-term impact of technology. And so when you think about it, I've heard a lot in the press about Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs put out this. They're a conservative organization, right? So they're not the most, out there risk-taking organization. And so they put something out that's been used consistently in quotations in the press, and their research, which was done with an economic lens, and they took the analysts and they looked at 2,000 roles, and they said, and the focus was, although they said AI, the focus was generative AI. What can generative AI, if we break down the 2,000 roles into its tasks, where can generative AI actually make an impact? And the misquote is that um, is that generative AI will replace 300 million roles across full-time roles across the world. 300 million. Yeah. And if you think about that, if you just let's explore that for a second. So 300 million, the estimate of people in the workforce today around the globe is 3.5 billion. So 300 million is about almost 9%. Let's round it up, 10% to make it easy for a conversation. That means, Paul, for every 10 people you know in the workforce, one person will lose their job, fully lose their job to generative AI. And that's generative AI, not just AI or not just technology. And there's a whole load of other things that are disrupting the market and disrupting the future of work. Now, that's a lot when you think about it. Well, I think that's a lot for a conservative organization to make that prediction. But actually, it's a misquote, because what they actually did was they said that the cumulative compound effect of generative AI through production sort of productivity improvements would release the equivalent of 300 million full-time roles. That's not the same as 300 million roles disappearing, right? And so actually, I think that in the short term, the focus will be on optimizing and automating tasks as opposed to full roles. Eventually, if you're asking me, your question was, how is it going to impact my role? Well, it already is impacting my role, but I think it'll impact everybody's role, but not necessarily now. I don't think that I'm going to lose my job now because of generative AI. And most jobs are going to be, over time, yes, there's likelihood is that every role and every job will be impacted to one extent or another. And there will be job losses, in my view. There will be job losses. But it is not as drastic a change in the short term, I think. In the long term, yes, but in the short term, probably not. And so, yeah, we've got to be careful about what's reported in the news, I guess. That's not new to anyone.
That's true. Yeah, that's definitely true. Have you come across people who have that fear that, oh, Gen AI is here, I'm out of work? Yeah, it's going to make everything we do redundant.
I think the fear that people have is that the execs in large businesses are making decisions that will impact on people's roles, and people don't know that it's happening, and so they're kind of worried that that's happening. So there's this sort of, are they worried that they're going to lose a job tomorrow? Probably not enough people are paying attention to that, I'd say, because I'm not saying they're going to lose their job tomorrow, but there are things you can do to prepare. And so, are they? But they're probably more worried that things are happening in the background that they're unaware of, and so, what should I pay attention to is probably part of the issue.
In terms of the sort of the corporate world out there looking at options for them and looking at generative AI as say a cost saving measure, do you think that there is, for somebody like yourself who does consulting as an example, do you think there is concern that you should have, that they're going to start relying on something like Gen AI to learn about Gen AI so they don't necessarily feel they need that human interaction to actually guide them?
Sorry, can you express that question again?
So,
Not sure.
if you're dealing with, say you've got an executive team, and this is from a personal experience, where you have
Yeah,
executives who think new product, new technology, great idea, will focus on that. Gen AI is often pitched as, this is going to give you the answers. ChatGPT is going to tell us everything.
yeah.
So we don't need to have that human interaction anymore. So how does that impact, say, a role like yours where you're there helping people sort of navigate these changes when they think that the changes are the answer itself?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, is there still room for human interaction? Is that
Yeah,
is that
yeah,
what's really
it's pretty much.
save our roles? Is
Hmm.
sort of the underlying question that sits behind that. Um, well, the scenario we talked about before of abundance, etc. If that does happen, then there's probably no need for people to work. So yes, that could happen. But will it happen in my lifetime? Absolutely not. Will it happen in my children's lifetime? Possibly not. But my grandchildren's lifetime? Possibly yes, if I have to think of some kind of time frame. So how are we going to get there? Well, there's always a need for human interaction. And so if you think of a doctor, somebody in the medical practice, there's technology now, and generative AI is included in that technology, that can support the medical, medical environment, reading scans and doing that better. But even now and in the future, I think there's still a need for the interaction between the doctor and the patient around what that scan actually means. And so, will that the need for that to disappear over time? Who knows? I haven't got a crystal ball. My sense, though, is that there will still be a need for human interaction in the flow of work, for most jobs, not all jobs, but for most jobs. So I don't know if that answers
Oh,
your
it does.
question,
Yeah.
but I it's not just a case of wiping that off. The even where things are happening right now, right? Customer service,
Mm.
call centers, you know, call center agents are augmented with generative AI, and so that they have more information at their fingertips, that they have histories of conversations that they've had with the person on the other side of the phone, and so or the conversation that person has had with the company as a whole, and so that's so much more powerful for those for those agents. But in the future, maybe there will be a combination of human agents and silicon agents that are dealing directly with the customer, and then there'll be a handover
Hmm.
point at some point. It gets to a point where human interaction is required, a bit like how chatbots are used today, but in the future, it will be far more with natural language processing, digital humans, avatars. That the whole interaction, a lot of the interaction can be taken by a digital agent, silicon agent, and so teams will be made up of silicon and humans, potentially. And when there's a need, the trick is understanding when there's a need for human intervention and the seamless integration of those two types of future employees together to be able to work effectively, and that it doesn't impact on the customer experience. In fact, it enhances the customer experience.
That's actually a really fascinating topic for me. My partner works in a call center. They train people there. And one of their clients is a New Zealand based airline that they do text based help services with, because they have accents and they know that the market here in New Zealand doesn't necessarily want to work with somebody who's speaking with an accent. It just turns them off. But from a text based option, not a problem. You can't tell on the other end what the accent is of the person that's dealing with you. But they've looked at some sort of chatbot option and it just doesn't work. Doesn't come across the sort of nuances and the colloquialisms that show up in language that I'm
Yeah.
guessing Gen AI is still running to play catch up with.
It is, but it will catch up. And it's just like, when everything moved offshore and we had these offshore call centers in India, Manila, etc. The initial attempts at doing that were pretty in the space you've talked about, where accents were very different. Understanding of the country that you're speaking to was quite different. But humans caught up pretty quickly, and people were inducted into. So if they were supporting Australia, they were inducted into Australian
Mhm.
culture, understanding local language and mannerisms, and the way that people think in those countries. And so there's no reason why a silicon agent can't understand those things. In fact, they can probably remember them and understand them equally as good or better, because they've got a massive ability to understand knowledge. Now, lots of challenges in the way of getting there: hallucination, bias, all the rest of it, data protection, all the stuff that we know and we read about all the time. But could they get there? Yeah, they could. Yeah.
Hmm. Actually, data protection brings up a really good question as well, in that machine learning obviously has certain rules it has to follow and certain guidelines it has to follow, because that's how machine learning works. When it comes to things like data protection, changing rules around the world, sort of kick in and alter things. How easy is it for something like a generative AI to adapt to different regions' rules?
To adapt to different regions' rules.
Yeah.
Um,
So for example, GDPR is like the be all and end all when it comes to data protection around the world. Here in New Zealand, we have a really simplified version of what you guys call the Privacy Act. So we
mhm.
don't have anywhere near those kind of protections. But we follow GDPR rules because we know that's what the gold standard is. But they don't have to. Right? Like there's nothing that forces a New Zealand-based company that's not dealing with European markets to follow those rules. They tend to. For something like a generative AI model, how easy would it be to sort of upscale from, look, this is basic Privacy Act to GDPR and incorporate it, or would it be? Are we more likely to see people going like, this is the gold standard of what the outcomes should be, so we need to generate machines that do that?
Um, right. So I think there's two elements to this, right? And so one is the application of the legislation and the adherence to it. And at the end of the day, we're still in a place where generative AI isn't defining itself. We're helping it define itself. And so humans are the ones that are putting the guide rails in, they're developing the applications that sit around the use of a large language model. And so large language models have the capability to understand masses of data and translate that. And so to help understand the legislation. So if I take just going to take an adjacent example to what you've given, there's legislation coming out around net zero and sustainability, and every country around the world has got slightly different views. And even within countries, like in America, in the States, each of the states have a different kind of, set of legislation. And so for humans to understand all that and manage that, it's a massive challenge. But training a large language model around global and local legislation and keeping that up to date with the latest legislation so that they can advise and give guidance, so that large language model can advise and give guidance on what you need to pay attention to for your company, in your industry, for example, in your country. That is something that I suspect a large language model trained in the right way would be better at doing than a human. But if you're creating an application to do a life cycle analysis of an asset or define an emissions boundary, then that's far more structured. And so once you've understood, it's helped you understand, you can use it to help you understand the legislation. But once you've understood that, you need to create a much more structured set of instructions and a step by step of what needs to be done. And in that sense, it's kind of more like traditional programming than it is creative, creative, a creative view of what needs to happen. And so I actually think that for me, it's balancing both of those, using the creativity and the ability to process data where it's required for us to understand, followed by a very structured process of how to put that data and that understanding into practice in the real world. And that's where you need the structure, the programming to kind of focus that capability on delivering what you're asking it to deliver.
For people who are out there looking at either career change or just sort of
Mhm.
straight out of school wanting to get into this field, what sort of advice would you give them?
Well, given the we're sitting on a data radio show.
Yeah.
If I think about data professionals, just let's just start there, right? Rather than people coming out of college. Data professional, whether you're a data analyst or a data engineer or a data scientist or even just thinking about the space, I kind of go back to first principles and at a fundamental level, generative AI and AI the traditional AI, the secret sauce is going to be no surprise to anybody on the call, but the secret sauce of getting that stuff to work is data, right? And so that whole idea of garbage in, garbage out, But it's even more pronounced than that. Um, you know, data professionals are the closest profession, the profession that's most likely to be able to pivot and succeed in the future world of AI. And what do I mean by that? Let me kind of just paint a picture, and you're going to have to suspend your reality for a second. But let's take us back to, I don't know if you're old enough to remember working environments of the 80s and early 90s, but
A little bit, yeah.
and so in those times, mobile phones had just come out. Not everyone had one, but a lot of people did have one. It was starting to get used at work. But if you suspend your judgment for a second and take anybody who's sort of listening to this call and their understanding of mobile phones and how they work today, and we port you back to that time. And it's like all of a sudden, there's a shift. You're in this place where even before the flip phone, where phones didn't have, they had text, but not very,
Hmm.
very clever text. It was quite cumbersome. And a mobile phone was usually largely used for making calls. There was no GPS. There were no
Mm.
cameras on it, and you're plonked in the middle of a corporate environment, knowing what you know about your favorite Samsung or your iPhone or whatever else you use, and all the capabilities that we now take for granted, and you're asked to help the rest of your colleagues understand what you could do with an iPhone or a mobile phone with all the capabilities that it has. You could
Mm.
do it, right? You could start to think about how an organization could use it because you're in that space. And that's the way I see data professionals, actually. You're in the space of data and AI and analytics, whether it's machine learning or it's kind of neural networks or it's large language models. And data is the critical secret sauce to make all that work. So it's time, if they're not already in the limelight, it's time for data scientists to get into the limelight because it's your time. It's a really exciting time for data professionals to be around. And so what do you need to do that? You kind of need, my advice is understand how value is created in AI. How is value created through AI? Use of internal data is an important element. So there's all that thing, RAG. Um, you know, how do you use RAG to train a large language model? I have no programming experience at all. I can't code to save my life, but I've got a large language model on my laptop. I've got a front end digital human that I use to interact with the large language model that's got RAG training that's got for my particular use cases. That's done on low code, no code basis. And so if I can do it, anybody with an understanding of data has got a head start. So understand how value is created. Think about agentic workflows, which is kind of just all coming out now. How does that create? How do you think about workforce where some of the work is automated and some of the work is human or oriented? Um, AI in the flow of work. Where can AI be used? Just get yourself around and understand things like, bigger isn't necessarily better with large language models. And so some large language models do things that are much more creative really well. Others do things that are much more structured, like programming really well. Understand the differences of a Mistral versus a Llama, and getting your head around that stuff is what will allow you to be that person who's brought the iPhone from the future into the 1980s and help your organization deal with the opportunities that can present itself by generative AI, but also the challenges and risks. We talk about typical common risks like bias and data privacy and cybersecurity. But if you think about your industry and the use case, the specific use case, are there any dangers associated with that? Specifically, like I mentioned, the medical practice. How do you get generative AI, if you happen to be in an industry that's focused in on medicine, how do you get generative AI through the whole stages of approvals that might be required, and what do you need to do to ensure that generative AI product will adhere to those stage gates that are required to go through. So massive opportunities for the data scientist, the data professional, to be involved in pivoting and really just flourishing in this world is what I'd say. And so get yourself prepared, and you've already got one foot in the limelight. Just move into it, because actually, whilst what's different about generative AI to traditional AI is it's accessible. There's two things really. One is speed, and one is accessibility. And when I think of speed, is it really different? AI has been around for 50 years, but it didn't take off the way generative AI is, and it's because people have accessibility and speed. The speed at which things are changing. I'm amazed at what we can do now, which we couldn't do 6 months ago. Things like text to graphics or text to video. Those things are coming out on a daily, weekly basis. And so, it's the speed of change is one thing. And that's very different to how it was before. I mean, if you remember, people compare it to dot-com
Mm.
internet, but I'm old enough to remember how slow it was when internet started. We take it for granted, but you had to put a modem, connect the
Yeah.
phone to a modem, and that
The
whole
the
process.
internet screamed at you when you tried to join it. It was, yeah,
Yeah,
and it
dreamed it
took forever
exactly.
to download a single picture.
Totally. And so, and where that took a long time to change. Whereas now with generative AI, the evolutions, the innovations, there's a whole lot of hype, yes, but there's also some real innovations that are coming out, and they're happening at the speed that they haven't happened before. The other difference is accessibility. So, so organizations and individuals are getting accessibility to those because they can. You don't need to be a programmer, like I just explained. I've got all that stuff on my laptop, but also to use ChatGPT, you don't even have to be a particularly good prompt engineer. You can actually use it with just the natural language that you would normally use, and you'll get better over time. You get better results, but you can use it. What the challenge is understanding how to use it and optimize it, understanding the risks associated with it, understanding what I talked about in terms of value. Where does value come from in this new generative AI space? And so, whilst in the old times of machine learning and AI, traditional AI, to get it to work, you had to have business people, IT people, and data scientists together in a room, and you couldn't engage with the business people because they weren't
Hmm.
interested. Now you've got a whole load of business people who are so interested in this. But what they don't realize, because it's so accessible right now, is to actually optimize generative AI solutions. Getting RAG to work is a real challenge. It's not as easy as just sticking your documents in and getting, vector databases and managing the data that's in there and keeping it up to date and chunking it in a way that a large language model, all very technical, um, and data related challenges. And so, to get it to work, you still need data scientists, you still need business people, you still need technologists in a room together to get it work. And the core component that's going to draw everybody together to make it work is data. And I think that if I was a data scientist or somebody thinking about getting into the data space, it's great. It's a really exciting time. Yeah.
Perfect. One last
And
question for you. How do people find you online if they want to connect?
ah, yeah. LinkedIn's probably the best way to get in touch with me. My surname is Theseira, Theseira. So these IRA. There's not many of us out there, and so Max Theseira on LinkedIn. You can find me quite easily. Would love to connect with people, and follow my posts. Get in touch. It'd be great. Yep, absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Max. It's much appreciated. I learned heaps today.
I don't know about that, but you've been very kind to listen to my ramblings, and yeah, hopefully they resonated.
Hey, thanks again for watching this week's episode of the Data Radio Show. or listening if you're on the podcast version. Don't forget you can track Max down really simply by following the link that we've got in the bio to his LinkedIn profile. He says he'd love to connect with people, wants to get to meet more people from around the world, so you know what to do. Just follow that link. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, tell people about this content piece, let everybody know what's going on so that they can check it out as well and maybe learn a little bit from it. Until next time, have a great week, and may the force be with you.